Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and I love Mythic Plus in WoW. It's one of my favorite endgame activities, especially because it has this full-on push potential and difficulty curve of Mythic raiding, but in a much smaller group environment, and I've been a big fan of it ever since I got introduced to it back in Legion. Season 1 of War Within started off with a lot of changes, from new seasonal affixes and adjustments to how affixes work to try to create a more consistent environment for push players, but also a little bit more variety for more entry-level players. But over time, the community has really soured with its experience over Season 1 of War Within, as it didn't quite hit the mark compared to the peaks we saw during Season 3 of Dragonflight, which a lot of people expected out of this expansion. We saw a lot of toxicity within LFG, a lack of tanks and healers over time when it comes to finding groups to play with many players finding it hard to get into groups because they just hit a wall because of the class they play or aspect they play when it comes to trying to get gear and improving the Mythic Plus score. And the Season 2 dungeon pull so far just kind of turned a lot of people off. So many are hopeful that they could turn it around for the patch 11.1, with the community voicing a lot of their frustrations about the current season, but also their hopes as to what they want to see during Season 2 of Mythic Plus and how Blizzard can turn it around and breathe some new life into M Plus in the patch 11.1. I want to go over some of those community concerns and suggestions that many in the community have been voicing over the last few weeks of what they want to see from the game going forward. As always, if you guys want to see more regular updates for the War Within expansion, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. First, we got the affixes, where the community has been fairly vocal on those as well. Generally, players like the thematics of affixes, and I gotta agree, I do too. The fact that we have for Season 1 all these voidy Xal'ata-themed affixes that give you a bit of a hurdle to overcome, but also a fairly decent buff after all of them have been adjusted with mastery buffs, crit buffs, cooldown reduction, all of those things. Generally, the buffs and the kiss curse mechanics that got going on, people generally like, because it gives you a little bit more variation week to week on different affixes and allows certain classes to shine during certain weeks. But also when you're pushing for higher end content like plus 12 and aboves, all affixes disappear. Instead, all the enemies within dungeons become a little bit more powerful, but it at least gives you a more consistent environment to push keys, because you only have to worry about the dungeons, the dungeon packs, and the bosses, and you don't have to worry about the RNG and misalignment of not really timing the key because an affix came in at a wrong time. The one affix a lot of players, however, do not like is the Challenger's Peril affix. It is not the best out there. I understand what they were trying to do. They're trying to make an affix to encourage good play and lack of mistakes, but it instead created a little bit more too much of a punishing experience though, because it punishes mistakes, and a lot of people feel that it's way too punishing right now, especially in higher end keys. When one bad wipe happens, full 5-man wipe, that can sometimes be enough to brick the key. And there's nothing worse than going through the key, doing well throughout the entirety of it. You got 3 bosses down, 1 more to go, and then one little mistake and you get a full wipe, and all of a sudden the key goes from you're flying through it to you cannot time it no matter how hard you try, and it's frustrating. This is something that I think is expected if, let's say, you're breaking records and are pushing some of the highest keys available. But for players that are doing like 10s, 12s, 8s, or anything lower, one wipe like this could just be absolutely detrimental and take a lot of the fun out of Mythic Plus completely. And putting the kind of pressure you would have on top tier players that are breaking records to also put that on players that are doing plus 7s and plus 8s, it just doesn't feel that great. It also leads to toxicity because players are then more selective of who they invite for their Mythic Pluses, so certain classes are going to be excluded. Certain players, unless they reach certain Mythic Plus breakpoint, even if they have the item level, even if they have the experience in a dungeon, if they don't have enough of a score, or if there's just something you don't like about them, like maybe the spec that they play, because nobody wants to break a key and one little mistake can just make it that much more punishing. Gearing is also another thing that players have been very vocal about for Season 1. The Valorstones and Crests continue to be a little bit of a pain. I don't think anybody disagrees that the whole upgrade system of Dragonflight that has made it all the way through the current expansion of War Within, everybody likes the fact that you can upgrade your gear, especially when you can take an item that starts out at lower hero track item level and take it up to a higher item level. Everybody loves that system, but is the management of Valorstones or Crests, especially for alts, that are really a pain point. And where this went wrong is a lot of players remember Dragonflight, where you could get a lot of your best crests from +6 dungeon difficulty, which will allow players to do some of those practice keys to pick up a little bit of Crests, to build up their gear, and it felt like a much better progression where you saw your character and you felt your character grow stronger and stronger, which allowed you to challenge yourself in higher level keys to then get better gear, to then continue growing stronger and stronger. But right now the only way to get this Crest is from +8s, which are already in the category of if you have too many deaths, then you break the key, everybody's probably gonna leave. And many players felt that they had a better opportunity to work up the item level and work up their gear so that they could finally tackle some of those more difficult keys. Crafting items has also become a lot more expensive. It takes you a lot more Crests than before in order to have them invested into just crafting one powerful item. In most cases, players have to choose between investing all those Crests for the week to craft one item or using those Crests to upgrade all the gear, where back in Dragonflight you could make an item and upgrade a couple of pieces, and that felt very, very nice. Also, a lot of players not really a big fan of how you earn less Crests when you fail to time a key, and many would like to see that kind of a punishment mechanic of getting less Crests when you don't time or getting more Crests when you do time adjusted to make it less punishing. Also, Crests and Valorstones make it a little bit harder for players to play alts, and with the warband system, there's so many encouraging ways for players to play alts, to play multiple characters, but gearing out those characters in Mythic Plus, thanks to the Valorstones and Crest system, as it is right now, it is still difficult, and many would love to see a reduction on Crest costs, or maybe elimination of Valorstones completely, in order to make some of that alt catch-up much, much easier than it has to be. The next thing that a lot of players are concerned about heading into Season 2 is the dungeon pool and dungeon design going forward, especially after playing dungeons in Season 1. The current dungeon list is available for this Season 2 as we have it right now. Unless it changes in the future, we're going to be getting Cinderbrew, Meadery, Darkflame, Cleft, Priory, and the Rookery from the War Within expansion. We also will be getting the new dungeon of Operation Floodgate as part of this seasonal rotation, which is pretty exciting. Cannot wait to see what Operation Floodgate is actually going to play out like. From the expansion of Battle for Azeroth, we're getting two dungeons. One of them is the Motherlode, which is not fan favorite. If you had to aim and rank these dungeons between Freehold being the best and potentially even someone like Borealis being the worst, I would say Motherlode is probably closer to Borealis than it is to Freehold, and I think more dungeons should be like Freehold and Atal Dazar. Another dungeon that's also going to be made available from BFA is Operation Mechagon, but for a third time in a row, specifically the Workshop, which starts out with the boss of Tussle Tongues and ends with King Mechagon. A lot of players were confused seeing this dungeon appear for a third time in a row in a Mythic Plus rotation. I think it would be fine if it was a dungeon that a lot of players enjoyed, but even Operation Mechagon Workshop specifically, even that one has some of its little kinks for them to solve. Specifically when it comes to Workshop, after the first boss, you gotta have a pain point of those exploding packs of ads that need to be line-of-sighted. That was always a problem back in the day. Then after you killed the second boss, you have to do a little bit of this hide and seek minigame. That was also a pain point that many players did not enjoy. And then before the final boss, there's a trash bag that usually most players try to skip, either with a Warlock Portal or invisibility potions. And that one is also another pain point that a lot of players did not enjoy from that dungeon. And would love to see a lot more adjustment in that department specifically. The final dungeon on this list, however, is also going to be a Shadowlands dungeon, which we're starting to see a lot more of them as of recently, with the Theater of Pain making a return, which is an interesting combination in a goblin-themed season. Maybe Theater of Pain will some way somehow play a small part in the dungeon pool, or maybe they just wanted to add someone in here just for a little bit of variety. And there's been mixed reaction around Theater of Pain, but for the most part it's a negative reaction, I'd say, because it's a Shadowlands dungeon and the whole season of Shadowlands was just not fan favorite except for a handful of instances. Then there's also some concern around some of the War Within dungeons, specifically things such as, I guess you could take a look at Cinderbrew, you could take a look at Cleft, Rookery, and some of the different pools and enemies. But Darkflame Cleft also has a little bit of this like role play element where you have to make your way through the darkness, pick up lights for the cart, which in a Mythic Plus scenario and environment, I just can't really see that mechanic working super well because it feels really claustrophobic. But then there's also a roleplay section where you have to ride the cart, throw dynamite at the darkness, the final boss, and a lot of players would like to see some of those things skipped. In a normal dungeon where you have all the time to complete it, some of those elements can be fun and nifty the first time around. But when you're trying to time the key, it feels like all of those elements of forced downtime where you just have to ride the cart and there's nothing you can do to speed it up. It might be better to skip those. Like you jump on the cart, it fades to black, then it comes back to the game and you're already at the end of the cart, moving on to the final boss. Stuff like this is what a lot of players would love to see in the future. Another issue that the community would love to be addressed is the lack of tanks within LOG and Mythic Plus. This is particularly a pain point because it leads to less groups being available for you to find for Mythic Plus content. At the start of the expansion of War Within, they ended up nerfing a bunch of tanks to make them a little bit more reliant on healers. And on paper, and I mean strictly on paper, at first it would seem like an alright idea, as long as they made tanks a little bit better at passively taking damage, maybe be a little bit more cooldown reliant, or from reliant on externals and big healing cooldowns from the healer or something like that, where healers can feel more involved, because we did see a trend of certain groups just eliminating healers out of their group roster instead of running one tank and 4 self-healing DPS classes that can sustain themselves just fine. But that only works on paper, but in practice that experiment I think didn't work out super well, because tanks can't feel bad to play. It's just not an option after players got to try them out for Season 1 of War Within. When a tank feels squishy, or even sometimes overly reliant on the group members for survivability, that's not really all that fun, and it does really feel like you are a tank, like you're a sturdy leader, vanguard of your group. And many players don't like the idea that one role has to suffer to make another role feel important. So let's downgrade the tanks in order to make healers more valuable. And everybody agrees the tanks in dungeons have the most pressure on them as a player, as a part of the group, more than the DPS and to some degree even the healer. A tank death will mean a group wipe. And as we talked about before, with the affixes we got right now, a group wipe means a dead key, potentially. Having tanks being overly reliant on the party members for a quick dispel for a healer, or emergency healing, or potentially even crowd control from the rest of the groups, or making sure that nobody misses a key, because those definitely always get missed when it comes to Mythic Plus content. Being overly reliant on your group for your survivability, a lot of players report not feeling super fun, not feeling really reliable, and also not feeling like a tank. And also, many tanks, in most cases, when a group death does occur, it usually tanks are the ones being blamed. It's just how it's been for a while. Which is why this season, over time, we did see less and less tanks queuing up for LFG, because it is very, very punishing right now to play one. You don't really feel as sturdy as you should be. You don't quite feel as powerful. You don't quite feel in control, because you're so, to some degree, maybe a little too much overly reliant on your allies. But more importantly, it doesn't feel nearly as fun as it could be, because tanks used to feel very, very fun, very, very strong, very, very secure, very, very reliable no matter what spec you played, and it was really up to the player's agency to deal with the damage taken. But recently, not so much, and that is something that everybody can agree needs to change soon. Another issue that a lot of players also want to see in the community is a solution to healers and their difficulty in Mythic Pluses as well, because healers are now more involved in tank survivability. Just missing one global and casting the wrong spell in certain dungeons can mean a life or death scenario with a tank. So if a tank dies, it actually may be the healer's fault in some cases, and that leads to a group wipe, which puts even more pressure on the healer. However, healers already have a lot that they have to deal with, because there's so much AoE damage in a lot of these dungeons, with many, if not most, trashback having a ton of AoE damage that's sometimes hard to keep up with, and makes it much more difficult for you to maintain everybody as they're taking constant damage, and then random party members are just being focused down by a single mob, which can lead to either the tank or other group members just dropping off immediately. Also, just like tanks, healers are usually the first ones to be blamed for a dead key, which also again puts up even more pressure on healers, which are suffering because now they have even more responsibility on their shoulders, with tanks being not as sturdy. So to compile together a list of what players would want to see out of Season 2 is to 1. Make tanks feel like tanks again. Make it feel reliable. Give them the control and the player agency to be able to choose how they deal with damage, and give them more opportunity to be more reliant on themselves as to whether they live or die in a trash pull. Also, many players would like to see a reduction in AoE damage for dungeon packs for both tanks and healers. 1, so then tanks don't have to be nearly as worried about their health and can make much bigger, more brazen pulls as long as they have defensives for it, but also it allows healers to be able to focus heal on specific allies instead of having to heal the entire group at the same time, while also your group members are still taking constant single target damage. Speaking of enemies, especially when it comes to DPS classes, a lot of players want to see the return of enemy spellcasts being locked out if you disrupt them in any way. Not just with interrupts, but also with stuns or disorients or any other forms of crowd control, to make sure that enemies do not recast the spells nearly as often. as too many casters does mean that you end up having to play into a very specific meta of tanks or anti-caster disruption type of playstyles, which ends up limiting the amount of classes that you can bring into a Mythic Plus environment. Because a lot of the times you end up getting into situations where you have a caster way out in a range, and even if you interrupt them, they'll just start recasting their spell all over again, never really grouping up with the rest of the group, making it much harder for you to control that enemy specifically. Also, a lot of players are asking if potentially we could see the return of buff scrolls, which were scrolls that allowed your group to get some kind of a class buff like a mage's intellect buff, or if your group is missing a druid, you can get a versatility buff. Maybe your group is missing a shaman and you can get this like mastery buff or something, like a buff that's not as good as what a class can bring, but at least kind of sort of better than nothing. This way you will be able to bring in classes and specs that are maybe off meta, like feral druids for example, or survival hunters for instance, which usually don't really get a lot of time in Mythic Plus spotlight, but it would allow players to play more variety of different options while still being able to bring in at least a portion of the group buffs into a Mythic Plus environment. Or maybe we rework some of these raid buffs so more than one class or more than one spec can bring that buff. Like you could bring a rogue for the traffic poison, or maybe bring a survival hunter for a similar poison with a similar effect. Or you can bring a paladin for a devotion aura buff, or you can bring like a beastmaster hunter with a specific pet that can activate a very similar buff, similar to a devotion aura, or something along those lines. Just so there was a little bit more flexibility in terms of the buff coverage and allowing more classes and more specs to have a viable spot within Mythic Plus content. And if all of those fixes were to be implemented, it would likely lead to making tanks and healers feeling better to play, so you'll see more tanks and healers in LFG groups, but also you'll get far more groups in LFG in general, as more players and more class options are now on the table when it comes to building a group for Mythic Plus dungeons. So in conclusion, essentially what a lot of players would like to see for Season 2 of War Within is very similar to what we saw within Season 3 of Dragonflight, which was a fantastic season and a lot of players loved it back in the day, where you had a lot less reliance on mandatory classes. And during Season 3, a lot of classes did have a variety of strengths to them, but there was a lot more diversity in which playstyles were viable and even strong in Mythic Plus content. There was a lot more variety to bring in between tanks, healers, and DPS. And I felt that just about every single spec, just about every single playstyle was fairly good for a huge majority of the Mythic Plus dungeons. On top of it, during Season 3, none of the dungeons felt overly punishing to play through. Mistakes were felt, and making a mistake in a dungeon, especially when you're pushing higher Mythic Plus content, definitely was painful. But one group wipe did not mean that the entire key was bricked, which felt a lot more fair. Like if the group is just constantly making mistakes and constantly dying to the same boss, there's no way you're going to be able to make past the instance. But making one or two mistakes felt like you could still potentially recover and finish out the key and even time it. And that created a much better environment where players wanted to finish out the key, wanted to give it a solid shot, wanted to see if they can make it all the way to the end. And it just got more players to play in Mythic Pluses in general. And a lot of players agreed that tanks should feel sturdy, kind of like they felt during Season 3 of Dragonflight. Healers should feel great to play in both healing or damage or whatever hybrid builds they end up choosing to play into. And the more variety of classes that we get to see, especially at some of the higher end dungeons, the better, and the healthier it is for the community overall, as more players will get the chance to actually compete and perform within Mythic Plus content. But with that, that's going to be the entire list of what the community would love to see from Season 2 of War Within. And I'm hopeful that they will listen. They have been a little bit more receptive to player feedback when it comes to endgame content, when it comes to class design, when it comes to hero specs. And I cannot wait to see what patch 11.1 may bring with it during the PTR, which will be the most important time to start paying attention to the Season 2 content, is once it's on PTR, because we'll have a much better idea of which direction they'll be taking the Mythic Plus Season 2 of War Within. But as always though, I do want to thank you guys so much for watching this discussion video, and I do hope you guys did enjoy it. It was kind of long. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very much appreciate it. Join our Discord community to keep up with all the regular War Within seasonal updates, and as soon as we know more about Season 2, we'll definitely be posting there as much as possible. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.